So this Charlie Kaufman guy dropped a new movie pretty recently called I'm Thinking of Ending Things, based on Ian Reid's novel of the same name. What makes this unique entry for Kaufman is that it's his first book-to-film adaptation since Adaptation, a film largely about his failure to adapt the book he optioned. Adaptation sits in a very shaky, volatile position for discourse. When something becomes meta, and the meta commentary is about failure to make the original thing, it typically feels like a cop-out. I'm reminded of this kid in one of my production classes who made a film about him directing the film itself, and at one point he just turns to the camera and goes, "I'm sorry, Professor. I've been busy, forgive me. I know this isn't my best work, but you gotta understand." And that was pretty much the whole film. Adaptation, on the other hand, being about the nature of adaptation itself, and extrapolating Kaufman's frustrations with it to his frustrations with screenwriting in general, make the film just barely come full circle, just barely get away with being a cop-out, and it's in this sweet spot that this discourse is able to erupt. Some would disagree that the film is about failure to adapt, would claim that the film rather takes a cinematically inaccessible book about flowers, and for all intents and purposes blossoms into something new entirely, and that process itself is a process of adaptation. Some other additional words come to mind about this process: transformation, co-option, exploitation. I have this image in my head of Kaufman as Mario riding the Yoshi that is Susan Orlean's book to get as far as he can before dropping her and finishing out on his own. After all, it's called Adaptation, not The Orchid Thief. If anything, Kaufman's the Orchid Thief. Of course, it's not exactly exploitation. Orlean herself was pretty happy with the book, but she certainly became fuel for something known pretty much exclusively as a Charlie Kaufman film. I guess also a Spike Jonze film, but that's a little beside the point. The fact that we can even approach it from all these different schools of thought attests to how rich the screenplay is. So from this film, we can gather that Kaufman is very much a writer of his own ideas, would probably subscribe to auteur theory. The only attempt he made to adapt a book written by someone else ultimately wound up being a vehicle for his own ideas. That's probably why he started directing his own scripts. So what could have prompted him to option another book all these years later? Something to adapt more or less conventionally, keeping the same title and characters and story beats and all? What else is going on here? Well, the book already has a lot of Kaufmanisms pre-embedded in it. I guess that makes them not really Kaufmanisms, but what we have on our hands is the intersection of multiple personalities in a single character's psychology and meta-presentation of the story itself. And I think that sounds pretty Kaufman-esque. And for this reason, as I mentioned, the story beats are pretty much the same from book to film. An ambiguously named character, who I'm just gonna call Lucy because that's the first name she's called and it's just easier this way, and her boyfriend Jake are in a car on the way to meet Jake's parents. She has some inner monologue about wanting to break up with Jake but feeling conflicted because she does like him. They talk about a sweeping variety of topics with unsettling undertones, and then they get to the parents' house, where she learns a little bit about Jake's childhood and his strange parents. Things begin to dip into the surreal as she explores the house, externalizing an identity crisis she's having, among other things. But before anything gets over the top, she returns to reality and gets back in the car to head home. She and Jake have another sweeping conversation, stop to get blizzards, have a surreal interaction at Dairy Queen, though in the film it's not Dairy Queen, and then stop at a high school to throw the blizzards out. Jake sees a janitor watching them make out and goes into the school to say something to him, and he never comes back out. Now from here, the film really veers off on its own path. This whole time, Lucy's getting constant phone calls from the same person who growls cryptic ramblings into the phone, and it's coming from her number. In the book she tells us it's her number, and in the movie we see her various names on the caller ID, which embellishes the identity crisis. The caller is essentially the villain. In the book, at the start of each chapter, we get what read like transcripts between two people talking about the wake of some violent act from the janitor, and again, Lucy's getting these calls. When Lucy follows Jake into the high school, there's a chase sequence, and she believes she's being chased by the janitor. But eventually we realize that the janitor is also the caller. Then through some more inner monologue, and some implicit gestures, and some surprisingly explicit statements, we start to realize that Jake and some of the other characters he talks about, his brother for instance, are the same person. We're reminded of the night Jake asked for Lucy's number, and it's revealed that he never actually did. He and Lucy never actually dated. From here we can surmise that this Lucy, our narrator, is pretty much just a manifestation of what he imagines their relationship would have been like if he had worked up the nerve to ask her out. She doesn't have a name, but rather a few similar sounding names like Lucy or Youchah, because they only met once years ago, so he only remembers that her name was something along those lines. It keeps going, and we realize that pretty much everyone is Jake, except maybe some idea of his parents in the past, but the parents we see interact with Jake and Lucy are just more manifestations of Jake's psyche. More importantly though, Jake is the caller, and most literally, Jake is the janitor. Lucy, who is also Jake, is thinking of ending things in their relationship, thinking of breaking up. But, as this is an internal conflict, Jake's thinking of breaking up with himself, of ending things, of committing suicide, and the caller is the constantly looming anxiety that motivates and pushes these thoughts further. The transcripts then, we finally get confirmation, are in the wake of the janitor, aka Jake's suicide, during which he leaves a journal, which itself is the book we've just read. That was a lot of explanation, so I apologize, but this is the essence of the book, and for the sake of the video, I think it's important to just spit all of that out. Some of it is my interpretation, but I'm pretty sure it's the main interpretation Reed wants us to have, at least based on the convenient book club comprehension questions at the end of the book. Maybe even less of it is literal than we thought. Maybe even the act of suicide itself is just part of Jake's internal conflict and he never explicitly does it. But it's ambiguous. It's not supposed to have a definitive, literal, canonical interpretation. It's a headspace. And it's this aspect of the story specifically that I'm sure got Kaufman hot and bothered enough to turn into a movie. Let's finally get into that. So, a lot of these devices, particularly the transcripts, are very novelistic, so these are what immediately call to be changed and adapted. How Kaufman handles this whole caller-janitor dynamic is by having Lucy wait outside Jake's apartment at the beginning of the film. Through the window, we see the janitor and hear the caller's cryptic rambling, which immediately associates those two things, and then we cut away, and then back, and it's Jake in the apartment, adding him into this association by editorial means, what an academic would call intellectual montage. But because we don't know what these ramblings are, or who this old guy is yet, we don't know what this association means, and it all just feels like cryptic surrealism at the moment. Then, instead of intercutting transcripts about the janitor, Kaufman intercuts sequences of the janitor going about his daily life, cross-cut with Jake occasionally nonsensically saying stuff from the perspective of the janitor, like interacting with the students every day. This went over my head on first watch, and I still didn't know what the deal with the janitor was, but having the context of the book made me realize just how clearly and extensively Kaufman is drilling this association into our heads. And we continue to get more visual indicators of Jake being the janitor, like the janitor leaving Jake's childhood home, or the thermos he carries, or Jake's slippers that he offers Lucy. And then when Lucy finally answers the phone, we hear the caller's monologue, the rambling we heard at the beginning, and that finally cements the connection between these things. That being the first big thing to adapt, Kaufman then fills in the gaps with his own references to the identity crisis, coloring in bits from the book to make them more surreal and even more resonant with the film's themes. Another big aspect of the story is aging. It's sprinkled all throughout the book, and I think what it's all amounting to is janitor Jake in his late years, looking back on his life full of regret about not living up to his potential and being someone like a grad student on his way to being a tenured professor, and about stuff like not asking for Lucy's number the night they met. The tenured professor stuff isn't in the movie, but we get speeches like,
"Made so many wrong turns."
What is the lie of it all?
I don't know. It's going to get better, that it's never too late.
And in a big departure from the book, Lucy's surreal romp through the house consists of Jake's parents aging older and older to the point of near death. And an example of what I mean by Kaufman coloring in bits from the book is how in the book Lucy asks about the scratch marks on the door, and Jake's like, "Oh, that's from our dog who died," and that's about that. But in the movie, the dog is still alive and does this surreal shaking, but when she's exploring Jake's room and the parents are aging up, we see an urn with the dog's ashes. The dog being dead in the book doesn't do too much to amplify this theme, and it's a relatively small detail in the movie, but the movie's full of all these details that Kaufman adds that support the themes even on a micro level. This aging stuff is then accompanied by a speech about time passing through us instead of vice versa, and the idea here is a lack of control, a subservience to time and mortality that feels almost ripped straight out of Synecdoche, New York. The other big departure that's very similar to this house scene is once Lucy enters the high school toward the end. Like the characters, this is a point of no return for the film. It very much cements itself as its own thing from this point forward. There's no chase from the janitor and piecing together that he's the caller and Jake and all that. Instead, Lucy immediately stumbles upon the janitor. They talk for a bit. She recounts a story about a creepy guy at a bar, presumably the real Jake, and when they part ways, an interpretive dance breaks out. The dance eventually involves a violent interaction that does seem to be some sort of adaptation of the chase scene from the book, so I guess that's Kaufman's workaround. But this is the most ambiguous part of the film. After the dance, we follow the janitor, who we now know as Jake, and he talks to a cartoon version of the pig that was eaten alive on his farm. And the pig has a little speech about,
"Someone has to be a pig infested with maggots, right? It might as well be you. It's the luck of the draw."
Meaning someone had to be the sad, lonely, suicidal janitor, feeding into that idea of subservience that Lucy touches on earlier, but in a way that's more at peace with circumstances. Accepting a lack of control, at the very least, mitigates regret, and the idea that you're where you are as a result of your mistakes. But this is just one more perspective, one more character who happens to be Jake. Another instance of Kaufman coloring in and embellishing an already solid aspect of the book. The pig even has a very explicit line saying,
"You, me, ideas, we're all one thing."
Citing this as a fundamental of physics, Jake and or Lucy being a physicist, bringing everything full circle and all that. Jake's also naked for some reason. I guess he's more pathetic that way, so the pig says let's get you dressed, before cutting to this award ceremony with Jake in a tuxedo. He receives an award and performs a number from Oklahoma, while he and everyone in the crowd, all the characters we've seen and more, wear the same elderly stage makeup. This relates not only to the theme of aging, but also to the award Jake's mom talks about earlier in the movie that Jake insists was a participation award. Which is to say, the idea of that childhood potential he's reflecting on as the janitor, and how much of that was just a series of expectations imposed upon him by his well-intentioned parents, regardless of his actual talent or knowledge. This whole performance feels like one giant gold star of despair. And that's not to mention how much further the makeup links everything. In the book, the transcripts reference the janitor having cochlear implants, which is what ties Jake to his mother and implies that everyone in the story is just part of Jake's psyche. Even though the tinnitus is still brought up in the movie, the cochlear implants are left out in favor of this more all-encompassing visual cue. All of these characters are Jake. Everyone is Jake. And this kind of suggests a universality that's almost opposite of what we've perceived thus far. Everyone we've seen has been an aspect of Jake's psyche, but now it's almost suggesting that Jake is also everyone else. That everyone is tormented by the same thoughts of mortality and whatnot.
Some universality in the specific, I don't know.
It's like you wrote it about me.
I'm not entirely sure what it means that Jake's mom is sitting on the stage, maybe something to do with Jake's rejection of Freudian theories, but this final performance is kicked off by one last woman under the influence raspberry. If I had to guess, I'd consider the fact that what incites the original raspberry earlier in the film is Jake saying that wine is a depressant and one shouldn't make big decisions under it, which we of course read from Lucy's perspective as a warning not to end things while, under the influence. But the raspberry isn't just for the sake of the pun, it's a rejection of what Jake suggests. So when he blows the raspberry at the end here, I think it's him getting on the same page and officially deciding to end things, regardless of whatever depressant influence he's under. So that's the film, and it makes sense why Kaufman would be interested in it thematically and formally. I mean, the book is great. Anyone in their right mind with the ability to option it would be fully justified in doing so. But I feel like that's just not enough for Kaufman. Even with the big deviations he makes, they're still just amplifying Reed's ideas. And as we all know, Charlie Kaufman is a writer of his own ideas. I think aside from mortality and depression and all that fun stuff, the story is also about pedantry to a very extensive extent. The couple meets at trivia, where Jake flaunts his encyclopedic lexicon. See, if I'm pedantic, ironically, that makes it okay. He shows off his big words, claims to be a cruciverbalist, and in both the book and the film, Lucy mentions how normally that sort of thing would bother her, but with Jake she finds it charming. Every time he goes on a tangent about the surface of Venus or the various stations in his E. coli lab, she goes, "I love when he talks like this." Now, it's not unreasonable to enjoy hearing someone geek out about something they're passionate about, But here it's definitely qualified that what Jake's doing is, by most metrics, annoying. Except to Lucy. Then, of course, it turns out that Lucy isn't real and Jake made her up, and this love for his veiny, bulbous vocabulary is just something he fantasizes she, or any other woman he's too afraid to talk to, would like about him. Everyone who's pedantic knows it's annoying to be pedantic. They hate everyone else who's pedantic, but they all individually hope that they're an exception. They want people to tell them it's charming when they do it. I mean, why do you think I have a YouTube channel? Writing a character who's a cruciverbalist, someone who specializes in words, as an author, which we all know involves words, gives Reed the opportunity to be pedantic himself with almost enough separation to justify it. And then for Kaufman, writer of his own ideas, who probably still considers himself a writer before a director, to adapt it, he couldn't just regurgitate Reed's pedantry. He had to provide his own pedantry. So instead of Reed's conversations about astronomy or a philosophical anecdote, Kaufman gives us conversations about John Cassavetes and a slam poem. Instead of a country song on the radio, we get a show tune from Oklahoma that then gives Jake, and by extension Kaufman, a chance to humbly show off his knowledge of Broadway standards. Most of the other changes in the film stem from the necessity to visualize the book's verbally stated themes, but these conversations are verbally explicit in both mediums, so it seems like the only function these changes serve is for Kaufman to apply his own brand of showing off. But that's the Kaufman thing, right? The line he walks that almost becomes a cop-out becomes just full circle enough to be narratively justified. Kaufman knows how annoying pedantry is, including, if not especially, his own. He expects people like me to call him out for being pedantic and annoying. With this film being a meta work, as so many Kaufman movies are, Jake is a vehicle for self-deprecation, for both Kaufman and Reed. Everyone is Jake. But if Kaufman were to recycle Reed's pedantry, then he, Kaufman, would no longer be pedantic, and Jake would no longer be a self-deprecation, and this whole facet of the story would fall apart in the film. So he was almost forced, by the nature of the story and by the nature of adaptation, to whip out his pop-cultural cock and lay it out on the table for everyone to see and praise and lampoon at the same time. Optioning this book was a willful act of self-parody that only bolsters the meta through-line of his other films, like Adaptation. That's it. That's why he chose the book, after just narrowly dodging failure and spinning it into gold with The Orchid Thief. So really, instead of pedantry, the thematic umbrella here is self-flagellation, self-criticism in the context of subservience, a lack of agency in being the way that we are, and coming to terms with the influences that shape us. I don't know if it's necessarily taking a stance on this theme. I mentioned Jake's rejection of Freudian thought, but it's certainly exploring a lot of areas under this umbrella.
It is tempting to have someone to pin it on, though, why you feel a certain way, why you are a certain way.
Person, an adult, has to at one point or another take responsibility for who they are. What do you think?
I could probably keep going, but now I'm hearing Jessie Buckley's Pauline Kael impression in my own voice, and now I hate myself. Maybe my logic isn't entirely sound. Maybe I got a little carried away just now. For one thing, inserting Oklahoma into the movie does lead to a quick flex on Jake's part, but a list of Broadway standards is nothing worth bragging about for a writer with the ability to Google list of Broadway standards and paste the first result into his screenplay. So that one's not a particularly meta act of pedantry. And besides that, it does serve as a visual bridge between the car conversation in the school, between Jake and the janitor, as well as punctuate the film with a final, visual-reliant display. Also, the car conversations pretty much make up the bulk of the film, so it's not like they're just placeholder conversation topics. In the macro, their purpose is to illustrate the ebb and flow of the relationship and how Lucy's feelings about Jake shift back and forth, but in order for this to really work, the topics themselves, while tying thematically into the rest of the story, still need to have some philosophical weight in their own right. You can't just pull a 13 Reasons Why and say, oh, they're young and on drugs, so if what they're saying seems superficial, that's why. But to the characters, it feels like deep conversation, and that's what's important. That would be an actual cop-out. As corny as it sounds, the conversation topics do have to be, for lack of a better term, deep. Kaufman, as a film boy, probably jumps at any chance to talk about John Cassavetes. I guess I'm doing that right now. But the woman under the influence conversation does add to the film's ideas of alienation, among other things. Lucy's character also gets some upgrades in the movie, for lack of a better term. The book, by being in her head, is able to give us a little more insight into her psychology through anecdotes from her past and other internal ramblings that don't quite make it into the movie, but she also has very little going on in her life. She even explicitly says that the caller and Jake are the only interesting things going on in her life. The only reason she feels any urgency to get home is because she's uncomfortable, which is maybe more compelling, but Jake's the one with work in the morning. In the movie, she's a physicist, a poet, a painter, and she's the one with a reason to get home. This puts her on the same plane as Jake, if not above him, instead of gawking at his intellect. She doesn't quite gawk in the book. She claims to be funnier than Jake, and in other instances besides physics jargon, we get the sense that they're speaking the same language. And she even has a moment where Jake's talking about the aerodynamics of cars, and she goes, "He's off on a Jake rant. I don't really care about fuel efficiency right now, or even at the best of times," suggesting that even in his own fantasy, Jake's pedantry becomes annoying. But I do think the lack of things going on in her life in the book is a result of Jake's lack of imagination for this girl he's projecting onto. Maybe a critique of the manic pixie dream girl. That being said, if she is that way to critique the manic pixie dream girl, you'd think Kaufman would lean more into that and flog himself, considering how often he's been said to fall into that trope. Though maybe it's an assertion on his part that he hasn't written a manic pixie dream girl, or an assertion, as Pauline Kael would say. Whether or not Lucy's a well-developed character is a can of worms too, because there's that aspect of basic projection I just mentioned, but also any complexity we see in her psychology could really just be attributed to Jake, because again, she's for all intents and purposes made up. Buckley does give the character a lot of life, and these do feel like conversations between two real people with complex emotions, but again, how much of that is really just fuel for Jake's own psychology? I don't know. I mean, I think these are questions for another time, honestly. Talk about it in the comments. Give me that engagement. I know you Charlie Kaufman fans can write. I gave Adaptation 4 stars on Letterboxd, and my comments look like a book of David Foster Wallace essays.
Give him that engagement.
Yeah, I'm gonna get that engagement.
Give it to him.
Then there's the big news I only just learned once I was in too deep writing this video, and that's that Charlie Kaufman just optioned another book to adapt, Yoko Ogawa's novel The Memory Police. So maybe he's just adapting stuff now, and he just picked I'm thinking of ending things because he liked the book, and it's as simple as that. If that's the case, then fuck me, right? You can forget about this whole video. I'm sure the book ties into his other work thematically. Based on the title alone, I'm already thinking of Eternal Sunshine, but I'm not gonna read another book for this video. I read the one. That's all I've got in me. This video's late enough to the game as it is. I'll save it for the next one. So that's me. I've done my work. You can take it from here. Go crazy. Links to my social media and Patreon are in the description. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day.
Wait, don't stop filming. You're gonna review The Boys next, right?
Of course.
Alright, you gotta leave that in.
Yeah, I don't think you're in the frame though.
But should I come in what do I look like? Yeah, you want me to do that?
Sure.
Do you want to do that?
I don't think I'm gonna review The Boys
Then
though.
we shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
You know what'd be even better than? What? If I came in dressed up like fucking the guy from The Boys, and I was like, "Oi, Clutch, I think you got a new review on the way."
Yeah.
You were like, "Golly." And then we